Looking back, it doesn't seem so long ago. He was bigger than life, God rest his soul. Why he died that day is hard to understand. Right there in the rain and the mud in July in Cheyenne. So tip your hat to the cowboy every once in a while, and take time to remember that cowboy's smile. A little part of every heart of every rodeo fan died there in the rain and the mud in July in Cheyenne. Hello everyone, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. I know I'm going to sound like a broken record right up front, but it was a pretty big weekend for major releases. Frankly, we've got a good old-fashioned lead into summer head-to-header going on between Paramount and Disney, as the former allegedly finally puts their biggest money-maker franchise to bed with a final reckoning to rule them all, and the latter tease up their latest live-action remake of one of their animated film classics. Neither of which I bothered with this Thursday, because when it comes to Disney, look, as far as I'm concerned, I paid my debt to society by enduring both Captain America 4 and Snow White. Frankly, I'm even prepared to go as far as saying I'll be ideologically opposing any new major films coming out of the House of Mouse for at least the rest of the year, in my own silent boycott that I think they have more than coming to them after just what slapdash disasters those two stinkers turned out to be. And sure, I know that with the combined power of Tom Cruise and Chris McQuarrie, another Mission Impossible movie at least has the pedigree attached to it of being a major studio tentpole movie that, looks like all the money is on the screen, looks like it's actually a movie. But I've also kind of promised myself that before even stepping into that arena, I'm going to have to do a deep dive back into not only the Mission Impossible films, but also that there are going to be other critics and online personalities that I'm sure are far better disposed to giving you the straight facts about the new Mission Impossible in their humble opinions. So this week, we're throwing caution to the wind and returning to a very special character of this channel, which is that I'm basically the only indie movie critic I know who fairly regularly explores faith-based media and contemporary Christian films. Though it has been well over a year since I reviewed a faith-based film for this channel, I'm certainly delighted to be stepping back into that world with the latest release from leading indie Christian film distributor Angel Studios, The Last Rodeo, a sports drama starring B character actor extraordinaire Neil McDonough as a long-retired rodeo bull rider who pulls himself back into the saddle in a desperate bid to win enough money at the PBR competition so that he can pay for his grandson's brain tumor removal surgery. And that's PBR as in Professional Bull Riders Inc., not Pabst Blue Ribbon, just so we're clear. See, you learn something new every day. And if you're new to this channel and owing to the fact that, again, I haven't really been keeping that much abreast of Christian movies in a while, you might be wondering why I'm even deigning to give my attention to this rinky-dink, squeaky-clean indie production where, spoiler alert, it's not a good movie, it's not even particularly well made, and basically all I'm getting out of these little research expeditions into the collective mind of the popular evangelical, it's basically just some anodyne, pablum, one-dimensional feel-good sort of movie, albeit with some classically shoehorned-in drama about McDonough's character's struggles with his faith after getting sandbagged with back-to-back major life tragedies. It really wouldn't be a major independent faith-based production without that sort of inelegant foregrounding of its proselytizing MO. But I want to make it clear because who knows, I might have some dutiful Christian viewers either returning to or just finding this channel, so it's really in my best interest to stress. Though I myself am not a Christian or a person who really has any spiritual faith of any kind, I don't watch these movies out of morbid curiosity. Okay, I don't only watch them out of morbid curiosity. For real, though, I've been paying particular attention to faith-based films since around 2014 when I first started noticing that, along with the general conservative cultural and political ascendancy in the United States, the water really was breaking on a new era in faith-based media where, while these productions and the companies behind them remain largely independent or at least only vestigial of the major studio system and their broadly secular output, these small and again largely cheap anodyne productions that are really only distinct from that general monoculture of secular pop culture because they have some shoehorned faith-based theme in them, they were rapidly coming into their own as a mainstream force in American consumer society, with more of these films getting at least limited theatrical releases into mainstream multiplexes, with more of them being paid attention to by mainstream secular film critics, and most importantly, with more of them clearly benefiting, ironically, from the hegemony of the major studio system, which, as it becomes more consolidated, as the barrier of entry becomes stricter, this has left what were formerly largely church-centered and really quite amateurish and non-professional feeling productions better poised to integrate with artists, performers, and technicians from all walks of life, including but especially individuals who are not, in and of themselves, particularly interested in the Christian faith, nor are they out to convert or to proselytize, but just make some good money on a small independent production that also, somewhat ironically, has grown all the more diverse as independent Christian producers and distributors have moved in to capitalize on all those genres that major secular studios and distributors have increasingly left behind in pursuit of tailoring virtually everything around big fantasy tentpoles and IPs. Which is all a very long-winded way of saying that in the past 10 years, we've not only been seeing a predictable increase in faith-based films accessible within the secular consumer marketplace, but that these films are increasingly being better produced, at least at a technical level, and that they are increasingly diverse in terms of the stories, settings, and themes they tackle. Thus, I find myself being in an eerie position of being able to acknowledge that if you've ever avoided Christian movies except out of morbid curiosity, I can't blame you because, look, the vast majority of them are utter crap, and some of them, depending on when and where they decide to get into political themes, especially in their role in drumming up conspiratorial fervor against the supposed encroachment of secular society on the religious freedoms of Christians. You don't have to worry. A lot of these films are not only crap, but like insane crap. But even still, I must admit, virtually every time I see a Christian film, even a bad one, as someone who went to Catholic school for his whole primary education, but as someone who is no longer a person of faith, these films for me often have an eerie way of inspiring, on the one hand, a creepy nostalgia for at least the feeling of faith, the community of faith that I once identified with and is still in some way a part of me and how I think, especially about moral and ethical issues. And on the other hand, not a morbid fascination, but a very genuine, almost inquisitory interest in surveying these films, watching them, and finding out, when push comes to shove, when a very mortal and very spiritually independent set of artists come together in the interests of creating a work that pays homage to faith and deals with essential questions relevant to Christian people interacting within a secular world, but in the process not only portray the obvious conflicts of their values with a secular and especially a socially progressive worldview, but even in some ways betrays the peculiar ways in which independent artists effectively find themselves writing and inspiring the new parameters of how they and supposedly their audiences will interact with and internalize and interpret the very meaning of their faith and what its values even are. As a film critic, I get something stimulating out of interacting with virtually any film, even a terrible one. But if we really want to understand the moment we are living in, especially one in which the ascendant evangelical Christian circles are exerting increasingly more and more tangible influence on our collective social, cultural, and political lives, look, somebody has to try to watch the sorts of things these guys make and understand them in a granular way that isn't just about writing them off as a living caricature or parody of what they believe. And though it is not a good film by any stretch of the imagination, first off, the screenplay for The Last Rodeo is utter garbage, and as a star vehicle for McDonough himself, I don't really know if I can think of a more startling example of a performer whose at least reliable, charming, dramatic capabilities were so underserved by the shallow prose of a screenwriter, except that McDonough also co-wrote this movie, so he's effectively giving one of the lamest performances I've seen him give in a personal passion project for him. For a director, behind the helm of this production is one John Avnet, a successful Jewish producer and director in his own right, whose career has taken him from seminal chick flicks like Fried Green Tomatoes to Al Pacino, Robbie De Niro alimony payment vehicles like Righteous Kill, to the present day where he's actually directed several faith-based productions at this point, while also dipping his toe back into the potentially blasphemous secular world with, like, an independent film about a psychiatrist working with 3 schizophrenic cases who all believe themselves to be Jesus Christ. But as the director of this quite low-budget production, God almighty, is Avnet phoning it in. There's so many scenes in this movie that end on so much dead air and useless emotional shots of the actors that you in the audience practically feel like shouting out, "Cut!" yourself every 20 minutes or so. Even for an avowed researcher of new Christian cinema himself, somebody who's plugged into this shit enough that I actually have a roster of favorite Christian films at this point, and just to get that flex out of the way, The Resurrection of Gavin Stone is honestly a pretty good Christian rom-com. As an ex, but also intuitively constantly relapsing Catholic, I'm also a low-key defender of Alejandro Gomez Monteverde's wartime coming-of-age film Little Boy. I had a lot of fun with the Mormon religious epic action-adventure film The Oath, and I honestly can't speak highly enough of Jesus Revolution, which was so good for a Christian film that it honestly became one of my favorite films of 2023, with honorable mention going to the rare Christian sci-fi escapade like Jim Carroll's Assassination 33 AD and Brock Heasley's The Shift, the latter of which actually features a great performance by our man of the hour Neil McDonough portraying the Antichrist himself, which I guess gets into more granular stuff about what wouldn't work about The Last Rodeo, even if they got a filmmaker who could still find his way around a camera, or at least an editing bay, because, look, I think McDonough is a pretty damn good actor, but he's a pretty damn good character actor, and unfortunately, especially at his age, he just doesn't have the look to be portraying a wholesome, classically American male patriarch, beloved and inspired by his grandson. My man looks like the devil. I'm sorry, Neil, I gotta say it. You got the opposite problem of Jonathan Rumi, the guy who, now that he's played Jesus, is probably gonna find it pretty hard to find good acting gigs as anything other than Jesus, or a production that cleverly stunt casts him as a guy who looks like Jesus. Once again, see Jesus Revolution. It's honestly legitimately fascinating how that film deals with themes of spiritual evangelism and inspiration, and how the messenger can fall from grace, so to speak, as he starts to eclipse the message he espouses. But Neil just doesn't have the face of even a classical American dad with a deeply flawed and troubled past that he has to pay shoehorn dramatic recompense for throughout this dramatic act of self-sacrifice. He looks like this sort of guy who should be playing, you know, a puppet master in a B horror movie, or the leader of a band of terrorists in a direct-to-video action sequel. Quite frankly, the image that McDonough cuts in this geriatric redemption story reminded me of nothing short of Joe Biden, which really put a damper on my ability to even take the filmmaker's good faith in this story seriously. The conservative movement might have taken full advantage of the Democratic Party's political malfeasance in making that beleaguered old coot the face of a safe new normal in America, but don't get it twisted. When these guys go into their fantasy realm, they have the same exact blinkered imaginary where you can tell they really get off on McDonough stepping into the locker room and taking off his shirt and showing just how sturdy and fit this codger has stayed long past his prime. Even in these movies that are ostensibly about inspiring a new generation of strident individual American believers, there really is no imagination for what that new generation looks like, so that they keep doubling back on these guys who should be put out to pasture and wheeling them out as the veritable image of classical American Christian excellence. I'm not a morbid viewer of Christian movies, but there really isn't much The Last Rodeo has going for it except that kind of granular, investigative curiosity, which ironically leads me to the point that while I don't think McDonough is the right star or writer for this part, he and the younger cats they pull out to play the bull riders in this movie at least look a lot more authentic for the part. I'm still thinking back to Twisters and how they pitched Glenn Powell as a typical example of Hollywood pandering to hollowed-out archetypes of rugged, charming Western American masculinity. A guy who apparently was a rodeo man himself in a former life, but, doesn't look like he does anything but go to the gym to look good on a Men's Health cover. Whereas not only McDonough, but a lot of the younger studs around him look like they're fit, but they at least look like they are fit for a purpose. They don't look like guys who hit the gym to be pitch perfect when they take off their shirts. They look like the sorts of guys whose fitness is really concentrated more around their specific needs to be able to ride, stand up, and bounce back from having their spines and skulls violently jostled around like cans in a giant paint shaker. Even without getting into spiritual themes, by virtue of the sorts of less coastal, more conservative audiences to which they catered, The Last Rodeo is a good example of how independent Christian films are uniquely poised to present an idealized, but nonetheless more accurate portrait of a world that most audiences aren't familiar with just because of their geography and the monoculture of most Americans' media diet. This is a shallow and largely incompetently written and produced film that is nonetheless keyed into what our secular monoculture tends to portray as an outback subculture of Americana when, for these people, for these characters, this is mainstream culture. This is a world they know intimately, and while I might not have gotten anything much out of it, I can tell you that the hard-drawing Southern expat and his girlfriend who were sitting up front of me in the audience I saw it with, they were definitely getting invested. They were definitely getting something out of it. Someone like me is just watching the rodeo and bull riding sequences and not being particularly impressed by Avnet's direction and how obvious it is that McDonough himself is not actually risking much life and limb up on that bull. But when the hits come in even this poorly made movie, if you've got people who are about that life, about that culture in the audience, you will hear it. Even if you don't feel the hits, they will feel the hit, because the frequency to which even this bad movie is speaking hits an audience in a way that honestly is clearly not exclusive to any particular spiritual investment in the movie. But for me, at least, the more granular interest in the spiritual themes of the film are still there, because in any secular drama, this would just be a story about a dad who has a lifetime of mistakes that he needs to make recompense for, and where he and his daughter need to come to terms with the old wounds of their relationship and blah 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 blah. Except because this is a Christian film, because the question of faith in an almighty and all-loving God is shoehorned into that drama, you get this really strange quasi-blasphemous allegory in which McDonough's character's estranged relationship with his daughter is mirrored by and even presented as allegorical of his own relationship with a God, his own estranged father in heaven, in which he no longer has faith. It really puts into stark relief the fundamentally deist worldview of so many supposedly literalist, especially evangelical Christians, because effectively, this is a film in which the inability of the characters as a cipher for the imagined audience in need of proselytism, their inability to reckon with their own trauma. It's conflated with the broader Christian community's relationship with a God that, like McDonagh's character, is so attractive and charming and strong and friendly and is capable of great transformative things and great sacrifice, but whose plans, so to speak, often set up believers in him for disaster and hardship and heartache and trauma. It's a world in which the divine mystery of how an all-loving God can allow for so much suffering is basically resolved by this analogy or allegory for God as like an estranged dad who really isn't that involved in our affairs and whose actions and plans are fraught with inherent flaws, at least how we as people perceive them, and where the only solution is to ironically make peace with a flawed God the same way we make peace with a flawed father. Maybe this speaks even somewhat to Abnett's influence as a secular Jewish producer and filmmaker, as a co-writer and director of this film, where there is a subtext for this film where it's not just a story about the grace of God elevating people. It's about people through their own grace, irrespective of whether or not they even have faith, through their own struggles, their own self-sacrifice, their own grit and determination, elevating God. And sure, this whole story and the whole message of it as far as inspiring the community of believers and the sympathetic to intervene for those in desperate need, all of this could be resolved by, like, what I think is the more relapsed Catholic, I think definitively Christian idea, which is, it's kind of up, even hellish, that we live in a country in which we say to the parents of a child that has a brain tumor, oh, you're on your own paying for that. What are we going to do as a society? Create a system of universal free healthcare at the point of service? But, that's just kind of these so-called Christians showing their own ass. They would rather make this sort of anodyne crap about inspiring people, the sort of story like about a child opening a lemonade stand to pay for his own diabetes medication. They would rather placate themselves with that than ever breathe a word that sounds even remotely like actually tending to the needs of the sick and actually agitating for a social change that would benefit everyone and not just elevate the feelings of Christians who are complacent to stark material matters, so long as they can feel their personal relationship with Christ is being fulfilled. So, on a final note, that nice little Southern couple that I mentioned before sat up front me in the theater. Thank you so much for stealing the reserve seat I bought the day before. Very demonstratively Christian of you to just take what you think is entitled to you, and then talking through the whole goddamned movie like the world is your personal living room. Very Christian of you guys. I'll tell you what, this garbage movie certainly found its target audience of selfish, culturally self-satisfied, and religiously vindicated assholes last Thursday night. The Last Rodeo, I'm giving it a 2 out of 5, far from a new classic of the new Christian film. But it's time I got out of here, so I'll just say thank you so much for sticking through this whole video, and don't be afraid to sound off in the comments. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.